and to raise any technical issues you may be experiencing by using the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be made available on the NILC website, NILC's Facebook page, and emailed to all registrants. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to Haley Burgess.
All right, hi everybody. Welcome to the National Immigration Law Center's webinar titled Safe and Accessible: Immigrants' Access to Healthcare, Public Charge, and Safe Spaces in Healthcare Centers. Next slide. My name is Haley Burgess. I am a communications strategist working on media and messaging at NILC. Joining us today are my colleagues Gabrielle Lessard, a senior policy attorney at NILC, and Myra Watching, a staff attorney at NILC. Next slide, please. And I will just say, due to the high volume today, we might have a little bit of a lag in the slides, so just bear with us, please. So here's just a quick outline of what we will be going over today. I'm going to begin by sharing our COVID-19 messaging guidance. Gabrielle will then share information on health provisions of COVID-19 relief legislation and how they relate to public charge. Then Myra is going to share information on safe spaces in healthcare centers. And lastly, we'll reserve time at the end to share resources and to answer any questions from participants. And before I begin my presentation, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items that my colleague just touched on. All of you as participants will be on mute. If you wish to ask a question, please use the questions box located on the right side of your screen to enter your question at any time during this presentation. Also, if you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar, including difficulty hearing the speakers, please let us know using that same questions box. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording and slides will be shared with all registrants by email. So I realize you might still be seeing the same title slide, but I'm going to move forward because I know we have a lot to cover today. So I'll be as detailed as possible to see if it catches up. But we are ready for the next slide if that is working. So NILC has put together a messaging guide for immigrants' rights during the COVID-19 crisis. I know that this is a more policy-specific call, but we thought it would be important to ground the conversation in a shared understanding of how we want to talk about immigrants' rights at this time. I know it's a very challenging time, and there are a lot of messaging difficulties that we'll all continue to face. As we know, anti-immigrant rhetoric is at an all-time high from our administration, and so we want to do the best job that we can in using inclusive pro-immigrant messaging to achieve our short-term goals, but also make sure that we're working towards our longer-term goals of having a more inclusive pro-immigrant narrative in this country. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with just an outline of what we know. So the global public health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19 has amplified pre-existing fractures in our society, fractures which threaten our collective well-being. We know that low-income immigrants and their families are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. We also know that immigrants are playing essential roles in the pandemic response, but largely are being excluded from relief packages. And finally, we know that immigrants are going to be protagonists in our nation's recovery story and will help us emerge from the crisis a stronger and more resilient society. So many of us are in crisis mode right now, personally and professionally, and it's easy to retreat to a place of scarcity. But as much as this is a crisis, it's also an opportunity to not back down and to make demands for policy solutions that we know are going to lead to a more just and inclusive society. As you know, we've been fighting for many of these solutions that we're talking about for decades. So what we're proposing isn't necessarily new, although we're being more specific. It's just that now more than ever, there's a highlight on why we need to fight against these policies and fight for more inclusive policies. And so hopefully by going over some of our messaging guidance today, we can give some insight into how to tackle that. Next slide, please. So I'm going to take just a quick step back before we dive into the messaging guidance to briefly go over some of our main considerations when we develop messaging at NILC and why it's so important for us to do so. First, we want to lead with values. So numbers and charts can be really compelling, especially at a time right now when the crisis is so data-driven. But it's really important to lead with messages that have the potential to change hearts and minds as well. We need to meet people where they're at by tapping into shared values and finding common ground to serve as the foundation for our messaging. So some examples of shared values, the idea that everyone should have the opportunity to provide for their families and loved ones, no matter where they were born or how much money they make. The golden rule that everyone should be treated, or that others should be treated the way you want to be treated. The idea that no one should go bankrupt because they get sick. So next, we want to be very specific about identifying problems and solutions. We want to know exactly what we're up against and outline a plan for how we're going to fix it. And in this case, especially, we want to present a vision for the future that we want to see. So we have an opportunity to present an aspirational vision for a more just and inclusive society. And something that I will include in the follow-up is the opportunity agenda. They're a communications resource, strategic communications outfit based out of New York, and they have some great interactive tools for developing messaging. I know a lot of folks on this call probably are not communications folks, so there's some helpful resources. So now we're going to dive in a bit to our general messaging. If we can go to the next slide, if those are working. So a big value that we want to tap into is the value of community and interconnectedness. So in these difficult times, we're reminded of each other's shared humanity and that we're interdependent. So our personal health and well-being is connected to that of our neighbors, of our community. I can only be as healthy as everyone else around me. And so we really want to hone in on that interconnectedness right now. We also want to stress that immigrants are among those who are on the front lines confronting this crisis, and they will help drive our country's recovery. And this means also, as professionals in essential industries such as healthcare and agriculture, but also as our neighbors and contributing members of our communities. As we've seen, our organic community response has been so central to confronting this crisis. And now we start to move into the problem. So in times of crisis, systems and structures are tested, and we're seeing this very clearly in the COVID-19 pandemic. So where our systems are strong, we become more resilient, but where they're weak, they fracture even more. Fractures in our health, immigration, and economic systems right now are threatening our collective health, safety, and ability to thrive during this crisis. This is an opportunity for us to reimagine what society looks like post-COVID-19 and to create a vision for an inclusive and equitable society that takes care of everyone, regardless of where we were born or how much money we make. And I want to call out that phrasing as well. Instead of saying regardless of immigration status, we really want to make it clear that we don't think anyone's success or safety or health should be dependent on where they were born or their income. Next slide, please. So now we're going to start by introducing some policy solutions, but we're going to do so by tapping into some of those shared values before we get more specific. So as we've seen, people with lower income and communities of color are being disproportionately impacted by this crisis. But we do know that the virus itself doesn't discriminate, and our policies to confront it shouldn't either. Divisive policies and anti-immigrant rhetoric only make this crisis worse. What we need is bold and visionary leadership to create inclusive and equitable solutions that recognize the role of immigrants as protagonists in our nation's recovery and create opportunities for all of us to thrive. Next slide, please. So now we get to the more specific part. We've identified the problem, we've introduced our values, and we've started to look at solutions. So now we need to be more explicit about those solutions and a course of action. So we say that we envision a post-COVID-19 society where our government cares for all of us and policymakers prioritize our collective well-being over partisan politics, one in which everyone has access to support and services that enable us to thrive. This includes pathways to citizenship, a stronger safety net that allows people to take care of themselves and their families and empowers them to do so. Strengthened workers' rights policies, so job security, access to unemployment insurance benefits, workplace protections, that includes hazard protections and paid sick leave. Medical care for all, regardless of where you were born or how much money you make. And finally, a suspension of the Trump administration's harmful public charge rule. So again, that's just kind of a quick overview of what we're looking at for messaging guidance at this time. As I mentioned, we will follow up with the full messaging guidance document that we have created so that you can look at it in more detail. And I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this webinar, or you can follow up with me separately when we post our contact information. And so now we're going to go more into the details, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Gabrielle Lazard, who is a senior policy attorney.
Thanks, Haley. Should we go to the next slide, please? So let's go to the slide that says introduction. So just to sort of frame the different things I'll be talking about, the COVID-19 virus is an international public health crisis. Because this is a highly infectious virus, it places everyone at risk if anybody does not have access to testing and treatment. So far, we've seen 3 bills come out of Congress to respond to the virus, and they really do not address the gaps in immigrants' eligibility for healthcare programs. In addition to the lack of access provided through those bills, the public charge policy and aggressive immigration enforcement deter immigrants and their family members from accessing services for which they're eligible. So we'll go to the next slide, just to introduce the COVID-19 relief legislation, and then to the overview of the legislation. So there have been 3 bills that have been passed out of Congress and became law in response to the COVID-19 virus. So the first was the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act, HR 6074. This did not provide any funding for individual treatment. However, it did include funding for the development of a vaccine and some funding for local health departments. The next piece of legislation was the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, HR 6201, which requires health insurance companies to provide COVID-19 testing and any future vaccine free of charge. It also allocated $1 billion to pay for testing of people who were uninsured, and it gave states the option to provide testing of uninsured individuals through their Medicaid program. However, it did not change the restrictive eligibility requirements that precluded many immigrants from accessing Medicaid. Now we'll talk about the CARES Act. The CARES Act is the big over $2 trillion coronavirus aid, relief, and economic security act. It increased and extends Affordable Care Act funding for community health centers, which is critically important because they are essential service providers in many immigrant communities. It also provided a $100 billion fund to reimburse eligible healthcare providers for expenses and lost revenue related to the COVID-19 virus. The first $30 billion of that dollars was allocated this week. It was allocated based on the amount of Medicare revenue that hospitals generated, not on the amount of uninsured patients or funding shortfalls that they experienced. The legislation also delayed cuts in supplemental funding to disproportionate share hospitals, which are hospitals that serve a substantial number of indigent or Medicaid patients. It expanded the definition of uninsured to enable people who had plans and programs that were less than medically essential coverage to access the testing that had been funded under the other relief bill. And all right, it's on the screen here. But it did not do anything to fund treatment directly. Okay, now to the slide, this is the work continues. So we all know that essential workers are really out there exposed to the virus and doing a lot for all of us during this crisis. Immigrants are disproportionately on the front lines as members of that essential workforce, including healthcare providers, grocery workers, agricultural workers, delivery people, and workers in food processing plants. As Congress works on another round of COVID response legislation, it has to provide access to essential testing and treatment for everybody who lives in this country. Now I'm going to shift gears to public charge. So public charge is, just as an overview of public charge, A public charge is a person who is dependent on the government for support. The way that the public charge test works is it looks at whether a person is likely to become a public charge in the future. If an immigration or consular official determines that a person is likely to become a public charge in the future, that person can be denied permission to come to the U.S. or lawful permanent resident status, also known as getting a green card. This is the public charge ground of inadmissibility. In rare cases, a person can be deported for having become a public charge within 5 years after they came to the country for reasons that existed before they came in. These regulations do not address that. So why is public charge a public health issue? Immigrants and people in mixed status families often avoid essential services because they are afraid that accessing services will undermine their ability to remain in the U.S. This is connected to being able to establish that permanent residence status. As soon as we started hearing rumors about public charge, we saw people doing things like pulling their kids out of Medicaid or dropping benefit programs. People avoid benefits that aren't even part of public charge, including the WIC program. We also find that people who are exempt from the rule or people that have already attained public or lawful permanent resident status are avoiding benefits because of fears about the public charge regulation. There was a Kaiser Family Foundation study of community health centers last year that found that over half, or nearly half, of their immigrant patients were refusing to enroll in Medicaid. Oops, my slide on okay. So one thing before I dive into the details of the regulations, I want to make sure that everybody knows that USCIS, which is part of the Department of Homeland Security, has announced that in its implementation of the public charge regulations, it will not consider testing, treatment, or preventive care related to COVID-19 as part of the public charge inadmissibility determination, even if that testing or treatment is paid for by public benefits that are included within the regulation, which would be federally funded Medicaid. The guidance also states that people who use public benefits because of COVID-19 related factors like quarantine or employer shutdown can submit a letter of explanation, and that implies that that would be a mitigating factor in looking at their use of benefits under the public charge test. Now, going to the next slide, the way that they presented that information is not accessible to the community. It was just a lot of incredibly dense text on their website. So all of us really need to help get the word out about those exceptions. So where does public charge come up? There are 3 federal agencies that are involved in the administration of the public charge regulation. The first is the State Department. So the State Department has policies that apply when people apply for visas or for permanent residence status at embassies and consular offices outside the United States. Their regulations went into effect on February 24th. The Department of Homeland Security has public charge policies that are applied through USCIS to applications for admission or for permanent resident status that are processed inside the United States. Those regulations also became effective on February 24th. The State Department regulations and Department of Homeland Security regulations are essentially the same. We know from activity at the Office of Management and Budget that the Department of Justice has also been working on public charge regulations. These would be public charge policies that affect people who have already been admitted to the United States and are likely to address deportation. So, important to know that the public charge test does not apply to everyone. Public charge inadmissibility primarily affects family-based immigrants. People who are admitted to the United States for humanitarian reasons are generally exempt from public charge. Those include refugees, asylees, certain domestic violence survivors, including VAWA self-petitioners under the Violence Against Women Act, people who are applying for or who have U visas for survivors of serious crimes, or T visas for survivors of trafficking, as well as people applying for temporary protected status. None of them need to worry about being inadmissible as a public charge at their point of application. So how does the public charge test work in practice? So public charge inadmissibility is, again, looking forward into the future. Immigration and consular officials will look at multiple factors to project whether a person will become a public charge at some point in the future. Factors that are set forth in the law are the person's age, health, family status, income and financial status, education and skills, and if they are required to have an affidavit of support executed by a sponsor, which all family-based immigrants are, whether that affidavit of support is legally sufficient. Now, looking at what the Department of Homeland Security and State Department public charge regulations changed, there were three major categories of changes. First, they created a complex new definition of public charge. Secondly, they took each of the building blocks of that totality of circumstances test and added a number of factors and standards that make it harder for low and moderate income people to have a successful outcome. And then they also added additional public benefit programs that could be considered by immigration officials. First of all, the definition of a public charge under the regulations is a person who receives one or more of the public benefits that are specified in the regulations for more than 12 months in the aggregate within any 36-month period, with the benefits being counted in a way that a person who received more than one benefit in a month would have more than 1 month of benefits counted. So for example, if a person was receiving cash assistance and living in a long-term care facility for 6 months, they would be considered to have received 12 months of benefits. Now, two important things to keep in mind are that this applies to the specific benefits listed in the regulations only, does not apply to benefits received by anybody other than the individual applying for the visa or adjustment of status. The second thing to keep in mind is that people who will be subject to the public charge assessment are rarely eligible for the benefits that are considered. A lot of people are avoiding benefits unnecessarily because they have already overcome the public charge ground of inadmissibility, the benefit is not considered, or they are exempt. So looking at the benefits that are included, federal, state, local, or tribal cash assistance for income maintenance. That means cash assistance that is intended to meet the person's day-to-day living expenses and does not include anything like emergency relief funding. It also does not include benefits that are considered to be earned, including tax credits, like the tax credits that people will be receiving under the COVID relief legislation, or unemployment insurance. That is not cash assistance for income maintenance. The other benefits that are included under the new-ish regulations are SNAP, formerly called food stamps, sometimes called EBT, Section 8 housing assistance, which is both Section 8 vouchers that people would take to private landlords and Section 8 project-based assistance that nonprofit housing developers would receive, public housing, and Medicaid, federally matched Medicaid, not Medicaid that is state-funded only, with some important exceptions for emergency services, anyone under 21 years of age, and for Medicaid received during pregnancy and for 60 days afterward. And then a reminder that Medicaid received for testing and treatment of COVID-related symptoms is also not considered. Now, the totality of circumstances test, all facts and circumstances that are set forth in the law, is really the most significant set of changes that the regulations have introduced. So some of the factors that have been added are, under the income and financial status tab, people whose households have an income below 125% of the federal poverty level that is considered negatively unless they have substantial amounts of assets. If a person has been diagnosed with a health condition through the physical that's part of the immigration process that could require extensive care or interfere with their ability to work or go to school or take care of themselves in the future, that would be considered a negative factor. If a person has less than a high school degree or the equivalent, or is not proficient in English, those are also all considered to be negative. How is this going to work in practice? The Department of Homeland Security, again, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, has created a new form, Form I-944, which is called the Declaration of Self-Sufficiency. The State Department has created its own new form, the Form DS-5540, called the Public Charge Questionnaire. These forms are filed for people who are not exempt from public charge, in addition to their application for a visa or for lawful permanent resident status. The Form I-944 in particular is extremely burdensome. It requires applicants to provide extensive information and documentation, including IRS transcripts of tax returns for everyone in their household, 12 months of statements for any bank or investment account that they want to have considered on their application. Copies of their credit report and score is available with explanations of any negative items on the credit report. Evidence of health insurance that is not a public benefit, so it's not federally matched Medicaid, including the type of insurance and the terms of the coverage. If the person has received any public benefit, then they need to get agency verification of the public benefits that they've received, or even if they've just applied for benefits, they need to get agency verification of that. And then for purposes of demonstrating their skills and education, they need to get transcripts, diplomas, certificates, licenses, any other evidence that they can present of their educational and employment qualifications, which may go back quite a few years, or maybe in another language they need to have translated. So hopefully after hearing all of this, you want to get involved. One of the easiest ways to get involved is to join up with the Protecting Immigrant Families campaign. The Protecting Immigrant Families campaign was formed in 2017 by my organization, NILC, and the Center for Law and Social Policy. The purpose of the campaign is to unite to protect and defend access to healthcare, nutrition programs, public services, and economic support for immigrants and their families at all levels of government. The campaign has done quite a bit of work on public charge, and there are numerous resources available on the website. You can click the link, which you will get when you get the slides, to sign up to either just get weekly emails or to become an active member of the campaign. You'll get updates, invitations to webinars, as well as opportunities to engage in different policy activities. So one of the policy activities that you can engage in right now is to sign on to a campaign letter by tomorrow at the close of business Eastern Time. We are making a number of asks in this letter that relate to the COVID-19 relief legislation, and they include halting implementation of both the Homeland Security and the State Department public charge regulations, ensuring that everyone has access to COVID-19 testing and treatment, regardless of their immigration status or the Medicaid eligibility rules in their state, ensuring access to the stimulus rebates for everyone who files tax returns, whether they use a Social Security number or an ITIN, ensuring that everyone has access to nutrition assistance, ensuring that health services and information about the virus and how to access assistance is available in multiple languages and through trusted community providers, and ensuring adequate funding for community health centers, which again are essential providers in our communities. You again will get the slides and you will be able to sign on and do the full text of the letter as well as accessing the link or accessing the sign up. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Myra Wachin, who will tell you about creating safe spaces in healthcare facilities.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Hello, everyone. So given how crucial it is for all immigrant families to access healthcare services at this time, we wanted to spend some time discussing the concept of healthcare facilities as so that we can all help families feel safer when seeking medical care. So during this portion, we will discuss the concept of sensitive locations, go over some of the existing protections, and also spend some time addressing why these protections matter and how we can use them both at the state and local level. Next slide, please. So since 2011, ICE has recognized the need to access certain spaces and barred most forms of enforcement at those sites. These sensitive locations include schools, hospitals, places of worship, public religious ceremonies, including weddings and funerals, and also public demonstrations such as a march, a rally, or a parade. The list is not exhaustive, and the list has often been expanded in other resources. Next slide. So, for example, in the accompanying FAQ that ICE has produced, ICE has clarified that healthcare spaces include medical treatment and healthcare facilities such as hospitals, doctors' offices, accredited health clinics, and emergency or urgent care facilities. As such, immigration agents cannot conduct most forms of enforcement action in these spaces, and families should feel safer when accessing them for any treatment or testing that they need at this time, and also to obtain any other medical care. Next slide. Now, I want to go over the protections of sensitive locations and also emphasize that under the sensitive locations policy, ICE is not entirely barred from accessing all public spaces at those sites. They are only barred from conducting arrests, apprehensions, from interviewing individuals, or searching or surveilling for the purposes of arresting someone. This means that they can still enter the site to obtain records and documents, provide notices to officials and employees, serve subpoenas or other official documents, engage in certain compliance and certification visits, guard or secure detainees at a hospital or a healthcare center, for instance, or participate in official functions and community meetings. Additionally, even if they are barred from arresting someone at a healthcare center, they can still enter the facility for that purpose in certain exceptions. So, for instance, if the arrest of that individual involves an imminent threat, that's usually a threat to national security or to terrorism, if there is a risk to the public safety, or when an enforcement action would prevent any destruction of evidence that is needed for an investigation. We have not heard of ICE entering healthcare facilities and using any one of these exceptions, but it's important to remember that there is a high bar to arresting or apprehending anyone at those facilities. Next slide, please. So why do these protections matter? Unfortunately, despite the country's current national emergency and the need for individuals to stay at home and be safe and secure, ICE continues to conduct immigration enforcement actions. It has indicated on a recent statement that it has adjusted its enforcement to focus on individuals who may be public safety risks or individuals who are subject to mandatory detention, but that is insufficient, as we know that any immigration enforcement action during this period will only create fear among immigrant families and will also show access to crucial care. Next slide. So I want to emphasize that, as we all know, we are all healthier when all families, regardless of status, are healthy. And despite ICE's continued immigration enforcement conduct during this period, they have noted that they will not be carrying out any enforcement operations at or near healthcare facilities, and individuals should not avoid seeking medical care because they fear civil immigration enforcement. So we urge you to take any steps available to you to help share this message and to remind families of the sorts of location protections that are in place, and also of this ICE notice regarding them not arresting anyone at the healthcare facility. Many of you on this webinar have developed trust within our communities, and as such, you are not only likely to reach more individuals, but you're also uniquely positioned to have this message heard by your community. You can access the full statement on the COVID-19 protections at the link on that slide. Next slide. And so lastly, in addition to help to spread the message that ICE will not be conducting any enforcement actions at hospitals and healthcare centers, and we encourage you to also adopt any safe space policies at healthcare facilities to help restrict any entry of immigration agents into healthcare sites. there's a toolkit and the resources slide that you will be able to access that can help you shape some of those policies. We also ask you to educate advocates, service providers, and community members about the federal sensitive locations policies and their limitations, to urge ICE to refrain from conducting any enforcement in general, especially during this critical period. We urge you to build or connect with local know your rights coalitions in your area, which can help include teaching others of their legal rights through the various know your rights resources, where you will also see on our resources slide. And lastly, we encourage you to report any potential violations of the federal sensitive location policy. You can do so by reporting them to the Department of Homeland Security, to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or to Customs and Border Protection. And there's steps and instructions on how to report those violations on the NELC guide, which you can also access through the resources slide. Next slide. And so now I want to take the time to turn back to Haley so that we can walk you through some of the resources that you have available today. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Myra and Gabrielle. So now we have a list of resources that you can access to learn more about these topics. As a reminder, all registrants are going to receive a copy of these slides and a recording via email. Next slide, please. So we're now going to begin the Q&A section of this webinar. As a reminder, please type your question in the box located on the right-hand side of your screen. We are now going to go to the first question. This one is for Gabrielle. Can people get accurate information about COVID-19, how to protect themselves, where to go, or who to call in Spanish? Where's the best place for people to find that?
I'm in California, and I know that the California Department of Public Health has put out information. Also, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, has put out information in Spanish. Health providers are required to provide language access to their patients. So you should be able to get that information from your healthcare provider. We will try to provide an updated list of resources as we come across them. Obviously, things are moving really fast, really quickly with this virus, so we don't have the complete list.
Got it. Thank you, Gabrielle. We have another question for you. I have a question about the funding from the bill. You said that it was tied to Medicaid funding or Medicare funding. I've heard about that, but I'm unclear on what that means.
Okay, so Medicaid is the funding that provides access for people who are below a certain income level. Medicare is a program for people with certain health conditions, but primarily people age 65 and over. The second bill, the Families First bill, included some funding for states to provide testing through their state Medicaid programs. That would only be for people who were otherwise eligible for Medicaid. The third bill, the CARES Act, provided $100 billion for healthcare providers. The first $30 billion of that money has been distributed to hospitals, and the formula that they used for distributing that money was tied to their Medicare billing. So the hospitals wanted something that would be more targeted toward lower income people or the number of beds in the hospitals. So hopefully with the remaining $70 billion of funding, they'll be distributed in a way that makes more sense.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gabrielle. All right, the next question is for Myra. The question is, what can you do if you find out that an arrest is made at a sensitive location, for example, a hospital, outside of the exceptions that you discussed?
Certainly. And I'm actually going to combine this question with another question that we received regarding the use of warrants in general at safe spaces. So while we focused today's conversation on the sensitive locations memo and how it bars certain enforcement conduct, it does not prevent the ICE from entering any healthcare facilities. like the public eyes can access any public areas of a hospital or a healthcare center unless it is denied access. One other way in which you can deny access to immigration agents from being in those spaces, other than by failing to provide consent for them to enter, is that ICE cannot access some of the more private spaces within those healthcare facilities without having a warrant. That warrant, specifically a warrant that allows them to arrest someone, would authorize that immigration agents to enter that space and arrest the individual who is in those locations. So that's, if you have more questions about warrants and how they play out, we do have certain PowerPoints on our toolkit site, so you can get more information on how they connect to sensitive locations policies. But in general, we encourage you to first deny any access to immigration agents from entering healthcare facilities. In the event that an immigration agent does enter that space, that you ask them to see if they have a warrant to be at that space. That warrant should list the name of the individual whom they're searching for, as well as have the address and the correct date. In the event that immigration agent does not have a warrant, you are within your right to ask them to leave. Should they go forward and continue to arrest an individual or apprehend, you can report that violation at the resources slide and using the NELC guide that's listed on that slide. And you can also email us to share that information at the email address provided on that slide. So one additional step that you can take is to connect with any local immigration attorneys who can assist you and see if there's any available that you can take to potentially prevent the removal of the individual who was arrested, given the way that immigration conducted the arrest.
Great, thank you so much, Myra. So our next question is for Gabrielle. Will individuals who became citizens in 2020 but were not citizens in 2019 be able to receive stimulus benefits?
It depends on how they file their taxes. If people filed taxes in 2018 or 2019 using a social security number, then they will be able to obtain that tax credit benefit. If they filed with an ITIN, which would really be unusual for somebody to file with an ITIN and to become a citizen the next year, then they would not be eligible. So you can be an immigrant as long as you file your taxes with a social security number, like a person with TPS, a person with DACA, or a person who's a permanent resident, and still get that stimulus benefit.
Great, thank you, Gabrielle. We have another question for you. Are you noticing ongoing concern about public charge from immigrants? Someone is saying that the focus seems to have shifted a little bit, and they're curious to know what you're seeing and what you're hearing.
Well, we're certainly hearing a lot of interest from service providers. We don't do direct service at NELC, so when we hear, our information about what's happening in the field comes through legal services attorneys, other kinds of service providers that reach out to us for information. If the concern is diminishing, that's great, but I just really don't know.
Thank you. A more specific question about the I-944. Is that a new form?
Yes. It's a brand new form. You can access it on the uscis.gov website.
Great, thank you. So we have another question that is, we know that we seek a kind and just society. How do we convince a populace that will take years to recover from personal and economic loss? I can take a first stab at this question, but Gabrielle or Myra, please feel free to jump in. I think this is a great question and a really difficult one to answer. And it's one of the most difficult parts, I think, about messaging during this time. Is, we want to speak more broadly about immigrant communities, but we're also communicating directly to people who are being disproportionately impacted, and a lot is uncertain and up in the air. So with our messaging, what we try to do is be very specific and try to take it kind of in bite-sized chunks. So focus, like I mentioned earlier, on identifying what the problems are and exactly what we want to do to fix them. And I think the more clear that we can be, the more reassuring or more reassurance we can provide and hopefully work towards more clear solutions. I know that that's not the best answer to that question, but it is, I just want to acknowledge that it is a really great question and a very difficult time to be trying to communicate messages of hope. So hopefully that helps. Gabrielle or Myra, do you have anything to add to that, or should we go to the next question?
I do not have anything helpful to add to that, thanks.
All right. Next question. Does the public charge rule affect those who became residents via a spouse? Gabrielle or Myra, can you take that one?
Yes, public charge primarily affects people who are family-based immigrants.
And one other nuance to add to that is that
you didn't hear me?
It doesn't affect individual. Well, no, sorry, go ahead, Gabrielle.
Okay, so at the time that that person applied to get their green card, the likelihood that they would become a public charge would be assessed.
Great. And Myra, do you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to emphasize that the public charge test doesn't apply to anyone who is already a resident, a lawful permanent resident. So unless that individual is exiting the country for more than 6 months and then seeking to re-enter, they will not be subject to the test. Anyone who is planning to adjust status to a citizen, for instance, would not be affected by the test.
Great, thank you. And I just want to flag that I think there's a little bit of a delay in the audio, so apologies for any confusion there. We have another question for Myra. ICE's website indicates that ICE may follow local law enforcement into sensitive locations. We don't yet have a blanket assurance from ICE on this, and how do we trust what they say? What would you advise?
So that is correct. That is one other exception to the sensitive locations policy, is that in the event local law enforcement calls immigration agents to the facility, or if local law enforcement is working in conjunction with immigration agents that authorizes immigration agents onto those sites, what we recommend in those scenarios is for any providers or local advocates to work directly to try to prevent any kind of entanglement between ICE and local law enforcement. We have sample policies and also sample letters that you can use. If you have any questions on how to go about that, we recognize that depending on what jurisdiction you're in and whether local law enforcement is actually willing to do that, might be harder in some locations than others. But unfortunately, because that is one additional way for immigration agents to enter those sites, the more fruitful advocacy there often focuses on advocacy with the local law enforcement rather than with ICE.
Great. Thank you, Myra. Next question. During this time, so during the COVID-19 crisis, can a permanent resident apply for food stamps without being considered a public charge?
If the person is already a permanent resident, they don't have to worry about public charge unless they leave the country for more than 180 days. There's a possibility that they would be reassessed for all of the grounds of inadmissibility, including public charge, when they came back after that. But again, remember that it's all of the factors. So just the fact that a person had received a benefit during a time of major economic downturn would not necessarily mean they would not be able to support themselves in the future.
Thank you, Gabrielle. Another question for you. If an immigrant is already in the US and they use public assistance on behalf of their US citizen child, does that still count against them in the public charge assessment?
No, benefits that are used by people other than the individual immigrant who is going to be applying to adjust their status are not considered in that person's public charge assessment.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Acknowledging that people are very scared right now, and they believe that even though COVID-19 is an exception to the public charge, they're scared that they will take it back later, or it will be used against them. Are there any resources out there to reassure those folks and make it very clear what the policies are so that they know what types of care that they can access?
I think that people are very persuaded by information that comes directly from the agency. So apart from that, extremely not user-friendly website from USCIS, I think that it would be easy for local groups and service providers to create a resource that incorporated that, but also provided more of an explanation. I don't know that anybody has done that yet.
Thanks, Gabrielle. I'd also add that, yeah, as much as you can, when talking to journalists, if they're reaching out to you, especially ethnic media services, if you're able to just make sure that those journalists who are covering it have all the information that they need so that this information is getting out as widely as possible in communities so that people know what to expect. All right, another question for Gabrielle. Hello, I was wondering if someone could clarify if Pru-Call Medi-Cal would count as public charge if the recipient is an undocumented individual.
Okay. So the only Medi-Cal that counts for public charge, or Medi-Cal is California's Medicaid program, is federally matched Medi-Cal that doesn't fall into any of those exceptions for emergency services under 21 or pregnancy. Pru-Call Medi-Cal for an undocumented person would be funded by the state. The only state-funded benefits that are counted are cash assistance programs that are intended for the person to live off of them. So, for example, in California, we have a program called CAPI. It's like SSI. That would be counted, but Medi-Cal for a person who is not federally eligible would not.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gabrielle. All right, we're one final question, and this one is for Myra. Can you give us an update on what happened with the public charge litigation and where that stands?
Certainly. So as people may know, there were several lawsuits filed around the country challenging the public charge test. Unfortunately, as a result of a Supreme Court decision, the government was allowed to implement the public charge test nationwide. And so the public charge test has now been in effect for over a month. Earlier this week on Monday, yesterday, the New York litigants actually submitted a request to the Supreme Court asking them to reconsider their prior decision to allow the government to implement public charge tests at this time, given the current situation that we're facing. There hasn't been any decision from the Supreme Court, but we do expect to have some news to share on that front within the next couple or few weeks. Once we receive news from the Supreme Court, we will be sharing those updates both through the PIF and the NOC listserv so that everyone is up to date on the current status of the public charge test and whether there's any chance of it being halted given the current crisis.
Great. Thank you so much for that update, Myra. I really appreciate it. So we want to thank everyone for joining us today and for being so engaged with really great questions. As you can see on the screen right now, we have contact information for each of the panelists. If you have additional follow-up questions, I know that we weren't able to get to everybody's. Can I have the next speaker, please, or the next slide, please? So lastly, this webinar is part of a three-part webinar series on immigrants' rights and COVID-19, and we hope that you can join us tomorrow for a webinar on workers' rights, critical labor protections for immigrant workers during the COVID-19 pandemic. And during Thursday's webinar on equal opportunities to thrive, rebates, taxes, SSN, ITIN, food security, and access to food programs. I know that some of you had questions on eligibility for the stimulus check, the rebate, and that will be covered then in Thursday's webinar. We hope that you and your loved ones are safe and well. We thank you for taking the time to join us today. and hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.